I woke up to the sound of laughter, engines, and music echoing across land my family had owned for generations. Hundreds of strangers camped where my cattle grazed, fires burning where my father taught me respect for the soil. They called it a community event. I called it trespassing. But when I stepped forward to defend what was legally mine, I wasn't seen as a landowner. I was seen as a problem, a threat, an obstacle to their comfort. What happened next wasn't just about property. It exposed how power, privilege, and prejudice still decide who gets pushed aside. And what I did in response would turn their celebration into panic. Before any of this happened, life on the ranch was quiet, predictable, and earned the hard way. The land wasn't a symbol or a statement to me. It was survival. Sunup to sundown work, mending fences, rotating grazing, watching weather patterns like they were written into my bones. My family had held that soil long before paved roads and manicured lawns crept in, long before outsiders decided the land looked better as a backdrop than a livelihood. I wasn't rich. I wasn't loud. I was just a man minding his business on property that legally, historically, and morally belonged to me. Every morning followed the same rhythm. Coffee before daylight, boots on gravel, bulls moving slow and steady through the pasture, calm because they were treated right. That routine was my peace. But peace has a way of attracting people who think they're entitled to it. Just beyond my fence line, a new HOA development had risen, shiny and uniform, built by people who loved the idea of country life but not the people who actually lived it. To them, my ranch wasn't work. It was scenery. And I wasn't a neighbor. I was an inconvenience. It started subtly. Curious looks. Phones pointed at my cattle. Complaints dressed up as concerns. Over time, those looks hardened. The respect disappeared. Suddenly, my land was being spoken about like it was public space, like history and deeds didn't matter if enough voices said otherwise. And every time I stood my ground, I felt it, that unspoken judgment, that quiet assumption that I didn't belong, that my ownership needed justification, that I didn't know it yet, but the line between discomfort and open disrespect was about to be erased completely. And once it was crossed, there would be no quiet way back. What happened next would turn routine into conflict, and expose exactly how quickly power moves when prejudice feels justified. The shift from tension to takeover happened faster than anyone expected. One week it was side-eye looks from joggers on the trail, phones lifted like binoculars, comments whispered just loud enough to sting. The next, it was printed flyers and social posts declaring a freedom campout on what they proudly called the community green belt. That phrase followed me everywhere. Green belt. It sounded harmless, inclusive, even progressive. But every time I heard it, I felt the weight of erasure. Because green belt was their name for land my family bled for, land that carried my grandfather's footprints and my father's sweat. I tried to stop it quietly. I documented boundaries, checked survey markers, tightened fences, replaced signs ripped down overnight. Each missing sign felt deliberate, like someone testing how far they could go. When I went to the HOA office to correct the mistake, I wasn't treated like a landowner with paperwork. I was treated like an annoyance. The tone shifted the moment I asserted ownership. Smiles tightened. Patience evaporated. Suddenly, I wasn't protecting property. I was being difficult, selfish, aggressive. Words that always seem to land faster on people who look like me. By Friday afternoon, the test turned into a full invasion. Vehicles lined the road for half a mile. RVs rolled past my gate like I wasn't even there. Strangers stepped onto my pasture without hesitation, dragging coolers and tents across grazing land, laughing as if history had already been rewritten. My driveway was blocked by volunteers who spoke to me slowly, carefully, the way people do when they've already decided you don't belong. I watched my no trespassing signs get torn down and handed to kids as souvenirs. I watched fire pits dug straight into dry grass. And I watched hundreds of people treat my home like a theme park. In the center of it all stood Karen, elevated above the crowd, megaphone raised, announcing victory. Not over land, but over me. Cameras were everywhere. Phones pointed in my direction, waiting for a reaction. I could feel the narrative forming in real time. Angry rancher, hostile landowner, problem man refusing to share. The kind of story people love because it lets them ignore the truth. When I tried to explain, my words disappeared under cheers and music. When I stood still, I was labeled intimidating. Either way, I was already guilty. Calling for help didn't bring relief. When the sheriff arrived, he saw the chaos, the fires, the blocked road, the torn fence. But he also saw a crowd that looked respectable enough, organized enough, loud enough to complicate things. The decision landed where it always does in moments like this. Civil matter. Hands tied. No one removed. No one held accountable. I stood there realizing that legality doesn't always protect you when the crowd decides you're the obstacle. And the crowd had already decided. As night fell, the pasture turned into a glowing maze of bonfires and generators. Music thumped through the ground that once held quiet. Trash piled against my fence. Gray water drained into the soil my cattle depended on. Every violation was visible, recorded, undeniable, but still allowed. That's when the anger settled into something colder, something patient, because I understood then that this wasn't about camping. It was about power, about who gets to claim space and who gets told to shrink, about how easily ownership is questioned when it belongs to someone they don't expect. I went home and opened the binder my father left behind. Deeds, maps, laws older than the subdivision itself. Every page felt like armor. While the party roared on, I prepared. Notices filed. Photos logged. Every action documented. If they wanted spectacle, I'd answer with structure. If they wanted to push me into a corner, I'd make sure every step they took was recorded on the way there. By morning, whispers had already spread through the camp. People talking about cattle, about danger, about whether they should move. Karen brushed it off, louder than ever, confident that numbers made her untouchable. But confidence built on disrespect always cracks first. Because at noon, the land was scheduled to move, and when it did, everything they thought they controlled would be tested. High noon arrived without drama, and somehow that made it worse. The sun sat heavy overhead, the kind of heat that presses down on everything and leaves nowhere to hide. The pasture went quiet for a moment, like the land itself was holding its breath. Then the gate opened. The bulls moved slowly at first, massive, deliberate shapes rolling forward, dust lifting under their hooves. They weren't charging. They weren't wild. But to a crowd that had never respected the land beneath its feet, they looked like judgment made flesh. Panic spread faster than sound. Laughter snapped into screams. People dropped what they were holding and ran, tripping over tents they'd planted without permission, crashing into one another as if the ground had suddenly turned against them. Phones shot into the air, recording, reframing the moment before it even finished happening. I could already see how the story would be told online. A dangerous man, aggressive animals, families threatened. No one would mention the torn fences or the stolen signs. No one would show the permits filed, the notices sent, the law followed to the letter. Fear doesn't care about context, and prejudice doesn't wait for facts. In the chaos, authority finally paid attention. Sirens cut through the noise. Officials arrived too late to stop what they had allowed, but just in time to witness the truth unfolding. The bulls passed through exactly as planned, calm and controlled. While the crowd scattered in disorder they had created themselves. Nothing burned. No one was hurt. Yet the accusation hung thick in the air, heavier than the dust. That familiar weight of being blamed simply for standing firm. For a moment, I wondered if this would be the image that stuck. If all my preparation would still be drowned out by louder voices. Then the cameras kept rolling. Not just the panic, but the aftermath. The trash. The damage. The reality no one could edit away. And as the dust settled, one truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't about animals or land anymore. It was about who was finally being forced to answer for crossing a line. What happened next would decide whether justice stayed buried or finally surfaced. When the noise faded and the last vehicle pulled away, the land went quiet again. Not the fragile quiet that comes before trouble, but the kind that settles in after truth has been exposed. The damage was still there. Torn grass, broken fences, ash where fire never should have burned. But so was the proof. Every footprint, every citation, every official report pointed in the same direction. What happened wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was entitlement colliding with boundaries it never expected to be enforced. The fallout came quickly after that. Investigations, fines, legal consequences that couldn't be talked away with charm or volume. The story people tried to tell online began to crack under the weight of evidence. And slowly the narrative shifted, not because I yelled louder, but because the truth stood still long enough for others to finally see it. But the impact didn't end with courtrooms or cleanup crews. It lingered in something harder to name, the realization that ownership, dignity, and legality are still questioned when they belong to the wrong person. That standing your ground can turn you into a target, not because you're wrong, but because you challenge someone else's comfort. That racism doesn't always shout. Sometimes it smiles, organizes, and calls itself community. I went back to my routine eventually. Same boots, same early mornings, same bulls grazing under open sky. But I wasn't the same. Because once you see how easily a crowd can erase you, you don't forget it. And once you survive it, you carry a responsibility to speak, to document, to refuse silence. This wasn't just my story. This happening in neighborhoods, workplaces, and streets everywhere. People being pushed, labeled, dismissed, simply for existing where others think they shouldn't. So the question isn't whether injustice still lives among us. The question is simpler and harder. When the line is crossed again, will you pretend not to see it? Or will you stand where the truth already is?